Hello, everyone. Welcome to the third installment of our four-part series on public humanities in higher education. Thanks very much for joining us. I'm Michelle May Curry, Project Director for Humanities for All, which, with the generous support from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, advocates for and supports publicly engaged humanities scholarship on campuses and in communities. Today, I'm very pleased to be joined by three project teams who have together worked to grow sustainable and scalable publicly engaged humanities projects within and outside of higher ed. The three projects we'll focus on today include the Poetry in America Project, the Emmett Till Memory Project, and the Nuestro South Project. And during this session, each project will be represented by a higher ed faculty member and a community partner. Elisa New is the director of the Center for Public Humanities at Arizona State University, Powell M. Cabot Professor of American Literature at Harvard University and project director of Poetry in America, and is joined by Leslie Kornfeld, who is the founder and CEO of the National Education Equity Lab and collaborator on Poetry in America. Dave Tell is professor of communication studies and co-director of the Institute for Digital Research in the Humanities at the University of Kansas and project director of the Emmett Till Memory Project, and is joined by Benjamin Saulsberry, who is the public engagement and museum education director at the Emmett Till Interpretive Center. Julie Weiss is associate professor of history at the University of Oregon and project director of Nuestro South podcast, and is joined by Eric Valera, chief operating officer at El Centro Hispano and creative director of Nuestro South. We are also pleased to share that all of the higher ed institutions represented on this panel today are members of the NHA. Note that you can view recordings of the previous two events in the series on our YouTube channel, which you can access through the event page link just shared in the chat. Well, the first conversation in our webinar series was on starting points for building a publicly engaged humanities practice. And the second conversation was on supporting faculty in creating publicly engaged courses. Today, the focus of our conversation will be on growing public humanities projects beyond higher ed. As public humanists expand their long-standing higher ed-based public humanities projects and increase their capacity to work beyond the university, they're learning how to better engage communities nationally and internationally. What tools, support structures, and methods of engagement can aid in scaling up a public humanities project? What new challenges, skill sets, and opportunities does this growth produce? After hearing brief intros from each project team, we will spend some time in conversation about these topics and hope to generate some fruitful starting points for those in the audience who might be thinking about ways of growing their own projects. Before we jump into conversation, however, I'd like to briefly flag a few opportunities for our audience to get involved with the National Humanities Alliance in the coming months. On March 14th and 15th, the NHA will be hosting our annual meeting and Humanities Advocacy Day. The second is the 2022 National Humanities Conference in Los Angeles, which we host with the Federation of State Humanities Councils with the goal of bringing public humanities practitioners from higher ed, state humanities councils, and cultural institutions together. We recently launched the call for proposals and encourage you to submit. You can access information to both of these events using the links just shared in the chat. Finally, a quick note on format for today's webinar. We plan to have plenty of time for discussion and questions from the audience following our conversation. Please submit questions by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. We'll be sharing links through the chat, but please be sure to submit your questions via Q&A rather than the chat so that they don't get lost. We'll try to field as many of your broader questions for the entire panel as possible. And with that, let's jump in. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. If we could start by having each project team describe their project for the audience, including its mission and outcomes to date. Perhaps each pair can also take us through how the project has grown a bit from its conception to its current iteration. Dave and Benjamin, how about we start with you?
Great. Thank you, Michelle, and thank you, everyone, for logging on. Ben and I are going to take you through a little bit of the history of the Emmett Till Memory Project. The history requires you to know two essential historical facts. The first of those facts is silence. And so if you start with the murder of Emmett Till, in the summer of 1955, you have to count 49 years and 11 months before the state of Mississippi dropped a single dollar on Emmett Till commemoration. Now, that 50-year silence was intolerable for members of the Mississippi Delta and people in the community where Benjamin is from. And so right around 2005, members of that community sort of organized, fundraised, and spent $10,000 of Morgan Freeman's money doing something that had never been done before. They started telling Till's story on the landscape of the Mississippi Delta by putting up an array of signs at sort of relevant spots from the story to try and preserve the story for generations. Okay, and then here's the second fact. Once the first sign went up in 2005, so 50 years later, once the first sign goes up, the nonprofit in the Mississippi Delta runs into a persistent problem, and that problem is vandalism. And so just to give you a sense of the scale of this problem, I'm going to share a few slides. This is the sign that was dedicated on July 1 of 2005. You can see it lasted only a few weeks before it was spray painted. This is the sign. If you could read these words, it would tell you. This sign is in front of Bryant's Grocery and Meat Market, or was in front of, rather. And if you could read the words, it would tell you that you are standing at ground zero of the American Civil Rights Movement. Nationally, perhaps that's a contested question. Locally, it's God's truth that the Civil Rights Movement started right here. And it's always struck me the sort of contrast of such a historic spot with the vandalized marker. This slide in particular, what you're looking at are the two posts or two aluminum poles that held the first sign that ever marked the spot where Till's body was pulled from the water. This sign was installed by Jerome Little and the Emmett Till Memorial Commission in the spring of 2008. And I don't even have a picture of it before it was stolen. That's how quickly it was stolen. It was quickly replaced. That sign was filled with 317 individual bullet holes. This sign stood for 8 years until 2016. I'm obviously moving quite quickly here. It was replaced in 2018. I'll let you guess how long this sign stood before it too was filled with bullet holes. The answer is 32 days. I'm going to stop sharing for a moment and cut away from those images just to tell you, so that long silence and then the persistent and targeted vandalism of Emmett Till memorials was the context of a 2014 summit held in the Delta, hosted by the nonprofit that Benjamin works for. And the context of that summit and the question of the summit was, how do we tell Till's story in the context of vandalism? And we came up with a very, simple but powerful idea. Let's use a GPS-enabled smartphone app. So that's the birth of the Emmett Till Memory Project. Our thinking was simple, right? It's a lot harder to shoot an app than it is an aluminum roadside marker, right? And so the ETMP, and I encourage you to download it. I'll throw a link in the chat as soon as I'm not talking. The Memory Project has GPS directions that will take you to each site that's relevant to the murder. We feature 17 sites in the Mississippi Delta and 5 in Chicago. We provide expert vetted and Till family approved narratives of what happened at each site. We provide historical photographs, and we provide URL links to archival documents that are housed in the Emmett Till archive at Florida State University. Version 1 launched on the now defunct Field Trip app in 2016. Version 2, which is the current version, launched in 2019 on a CurateScape platform. And we are currently, as we speak, working on version 3. So hopefully that will launch soon. I share all those versions because the title of today's talk is Scaling Up. And the entire history of the Emmett Till Memory Project has been a history of dreaming big, but building what we can with what we got. And then using what we got to build a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more. It's a project that never ends, but I've turned out to be grateful for that. Let me, with that brief introduction to the history and mission of the project, let me toss it over to Benjamin, who works with the Emmett Till Interpretive Center.
Well, thank you, Dave. Excuse me. So, I've had the great privilege and honor of working with the Interpretive Center now, really officially ever since January of 2017. With that being said, speaking very matter-of-factly concerning how we've been able to use and or encourage the use of this app within our community and with those that visit, it served as a supplementary tool in a lot of ways. So speaking very specific again about the work I do, a lot of times when we have visitors, a lot of those visitors are interested in the Till tragedy and or interested in how the Delta and Tallahatchie County is connected to this narrative. So it's one thing for me as an individual who, at least to the degree that I can, speak to certain realities as it pertains to race, racism, and racial reconciliation. And again, those things being part of the Till tragedy. But it's a whole other thing when you have an app or you have a device, that helps. And what I mean by that is this app, it has allowed people to not just visit the Interpretive Center or the courthouse, but it's positioned them to go throughout places within the Delta and other places too, but definitely Delta sites that are tied to the Till tragedy. So as Dr. Till shared a moment ago, in light of the fact that a few of the markers have been targets of vandalism throughout the past, having technology available for folks who are not from the area, who may not be familiar with the area and or familiar with this narrative, having that app helps acclimate them a little bit more into this space. And when I say this space, I mean into what the Delta and what, in some ways, what society as a whole was like in '55, while also connecting them to the present. So being, being one that works very closely with folks that are interested in the Till narrative, that are interested in hearing more about Emmett Till and or hearing more about our own county and communities reckoning with race and racism. We've been really fortunate, that this app exists and that it's vetted so well and that there's so much accurate historical context. So yeah, it's truly been a benefit to us as an organization and in some ways even our community. So definitely want to give a great thank you to Dr. Till for the work he's doing and for our continued partnership.
Thank you so much, Ben and Dave. Let's move to Lisa and Leslie.
Hi, I'm Lisa New, and I'm the director of Poetry in America. Poetry in America is a multi-platform initiative that includes a lot of programs, but two key ones are a public television series that evolved out of a series of massive open online courses I made back in 2013, and a large and growing program of educational experiences, including 4-credit courses offered to dual enrollment students in partnership with Leslie's organization, the National Education Equities Lab. National Education Equity, although there are many equities that you address. I thought I would just use the first few minutes here to describe how it is that it became so clear to me that I needed a partner like Leslie, and how valuable it has been to forge that relationship. Poetry in America began, as I said, as a set of massive open online courses I was making with Harvard. Like many institutions, Harvard had great enthusiasm for bringing the resources of its institution, its archives, and the expertise of its faculty into new formats and through new channels. And there was enormous emphasis on the quality of what was created in the early years of the massive open online courses. Harvard was not as enthusiastic, or I thought, I'll just be frank, thoughtful about who was going to benefit from what it created. It did in sort of in the early years have a sense, we will build it and they will come. I rapidly saw that I had, thanks to Harvard, been able to develop content that would not only benefit learners who were taking a course sort of recreationally for free, but I had content that might be illuminating and useful to general audiences and could in fact become a television series. But more important, and I did learn this from the early massive open online course experience, more important, there were thousands and thousands and thousands of K-12 teachers out there who were looking for infusions of high quality, engaging content to educate themselves and to share with their students. I spent several years educating myself in how one navigates a university system. I got tough and used to being told no in ways that I got resourceful and ready if, knocking on one door didn't work, to go. And so I made the rounds of almost every school over 4 or 5 years, made the rounds of every school looking for the right distribution partner, and I'm almost there, Leslie, had for many years a lot of success beginning to scale distribution of 4 credit and 4 professional development versions of the massive open online course content that I'd begun now at this point to blend with TV content. What was completely clear to me from really the first 6 months of offering this content was that credentials for which someone paid, didn't have to be the individual in question, but credentials for which someone paid were really, really important in getting completion and thus utility for the content I created. And so when I met Leslie, I had successfully established a set of 5 online courses on poetry that were being offered through Harvard Extension School. I got no teaching credit for this. This was all outside my ordinary teaching load, but there were 5 courses. I had negotiated a set of agreements that provided scholarships to some, and I was growing. And I in 2018, I had 800 students. I thought that was really great. Harvard wasn't so sure. And then I met Leslie Kornfeld. And Leslie said, wait, you've got these engaging, interesting courses that, and you've got some high school students in them. And I said, yeah, I've got, I don't know, 50, 60, 70 high school students in them. Harvard doesn't make it easy. And Leslie proposed the following. Leslie.
Okay. I didn't realize that was my cue. So
that was your cue.
Okay.
Leslie proposed, why don't I bring you hundreds of students?
Great. Well, I know that one of the themes here is scale and partnership. And I have to say that I think it's that having a person like Lisa that is a force of nature and so passionate about her work in the humanities, just the ability to impact lives by having a partner like that is immeasurable. So my background is in civil rights. I was a federal civil rights prosecutor for over a decade, and through that began to understand that education is the civil rights issue of our time. And so when Lisa shared what she was doing, it really made myself, my board, my team think about how do we bring an opportunity like this to scale, and how do we bring it to students who rarely have an opportunity to have this kind of quality academic rigor, and both so that they can see what they are capable of achieving, and as important, they can use that as a metric of success to apply to colleges and from there beyond. And so at the National Education Equity Lab used Lisa, and the Poetry in America class was our pilot for a model that Lisa talked about, bringing college credit-bearing courses into underserved high school classrooms with teachers that are co-teaching it. And that's the model. And with Lisa, we started out with her Humanities Poetry in America course for under 300 students. That was in 2019. And we have reached thousands of students to date, over 3,000 students in total. And I think that I become a true believer in the power of the humanities to impact young people and students in these schools as a lever to change mindsets, to show them what it means to analyze text, to show them that they can do it, to have them reach a part of them. Lisa and I traveled to Flint, Michigan together, met with students, and I was struck by the number of students who were athletes that had never thought of themselves as scholars, but certainly had the talent, but no one had ever said to them that you are smart, you have the talent to get an A, to succeed in a Harvard or ASU humanities course. And what that did to students, the mindset shifts that we saw were extraordinary. There's a young woman in Navajo Nation that we shared in Gallup, New Mexico, Lisa's course with, and just one of so many examples. This is a young woman in Navajo Nation who got an A in Lisa's course, and her brother said to her, you need to apply off of the reservation to college, which she had never thought of because she hadn't been exposed to opportunities like this. So she applied to Columbia, got a full scholarship, and is a second-year student that's just really doing extraordinarily well there. And I raise that just again to show the power of the humanities, the power of thinking about the humanities at scale. And so that's it. And this was designed for scale. You have an asynchronous course. You have a classroom teacher that co-teaches this instead of something else. And Lisa's was a model for us, for the nation. And we've now brought together the Ed Equity Lab, over a dozen selective colleges and universities that are offering over a dozen college credit-bearing courses in Title I underserved communities based on the model that Lisa started. And we are right now on track to reach over 10,000 students by the end of this year. And Lisa's class is the largest, most popular of our courses, which goes to show the power of the humanities in showing students what they can achieve. So
thank you so much,
Thank
Lisa
you,
and
Leslie.
Leslie. Julie and Eric.
Awesome, thank you. So yeah, the community partnership starts right with the inception with our project. Our project is the Nuestro South project, which is a project that engages Latino, Latina, and Latinx youth in the US South in interpreting and sharing stories from history with their peers via social media, podcasting, YouTube, and just now forays into TikTok. So our story really begins with the publication of my book, Corazón de Dixie, Mexicanos in the US South since 1910, which was published in 2015. and told stories of Mexican communities and Mexican American communities in places like New Orleans and Mississippi and Arkansas and Georgia, going all the way back to the early 20th century, which were histories that had been both erased by surrounding communities and narratives, and also self-erased because many of the Mexican American children were given the opportunity to assimilate onto the white side of the color line and did so, and specifically avoided discussing the past or their family's Mexican heritage. But of course, now we have these very large populations of Latinx young people in the South asking their teachers, which drinking fountain would I have drunk from, and how does all of this relate to me? So when I published the book, I had a fantasy that somebody would care about it in the community and that history could be useful to people, but I really had no brilliant ideas about how to achieve that. But fortunately, UNC Press was very good at placing me in, media opportunities. And so I did an interview on WUNC radio in Chapel Hill talking about my book. And then upon minding my own business and planning my maternity leave and things like that, I got an email out of the blue from Eric Valera, whom I had never met before. And I'll let him speak a bit about what happened next. Oh, you're muted, Eric.
So shout out to WUNC and NPR, support your local public radio and find a place for Nuestro South in it. So what I had been working on research projects, looking at community engagement within Latino, Latinx communities throughout the South. And some of the things that had come from that is that there was a whole generation of young people who have come of age in the South who have a sense of otherness. They grew up in a binary environment. They're not being represented in history books and education or in media. This is the case across the country for Latinos, but it's even more so in the South. And so what we're seeing is that there's a lot of people who feel invisible, isolated, and for that part, stigmatized for their identity. So I'd really been thinking about how to be able to help develop a way to be able to provide more of a sense of entitlement, of belonging to the place where folks are growing up in, and to be able to help develop more of a sense of leadership and engagement in the community. And so learning about Julie's work, it really occurred that that's the thing. We don't have a written history, or we've been written out of history, to say. And so we started with this iterative project of trying to figure out what is the best way of making these stories accessible to these young populations who can really benefit from them the most. And we've developed this a multimedia project because it's gone into different types of stories. And so we want to be able to provide them the stories so that they can then share them where they're meeting their peers, be it social media, be it podcasting. And it's for them to be able to help share those stories. So through this project, Julie supports with assuring that the history is accurate and that it is evidence-based. And we're developing, we want to really develop the next generation of storytellers to be able to express themselves in whatever medium it is, and engage others around these stories. And we often don't think of Latinos when you're thinking of the South, but this is where I live in North Carolina. We make up 10% of the population. And so this is a growing population, and most of this growth is coming from births. And so we have a huge population that needs to be engaged. And we feel like Nuestro South has struck a nerve within these communities, and people we found are very excited to learn about it, and we couldn't be more excited to share it. Thank you.
So basically, the Whiting Foundation Whiting Foundation took a chance on us, giving me a fellowship to start this project with Eric. We had a great road trip plan to the historical sites of the Mexican and the Mexican-American history of the South. The funding came through in February 2020. Needless to say, the road trip no longer seemed very feasible, but instead what we've done is done a huge, much larger quantity of content than we could ever have done if we had spent all the money on that road trip. And essentially we worked with, Eric found us the perfect community partner organization called Latinx Ed, which is a nonprofit based at UNC Chapel Hill that works basically engaging college students and high school students in various projects to promote educational aspiration and success in North Carolina. And so through Latinx Ed, we were able to recruit some amazing college students who were Latino and Latina and had grown up in the area. And we were able to pay them for their work, reading my book and reinterpreting it for their peers via a podcast. And in terms of our scaling up journey, then moving on to YouTube. And in the age of COVID, hiring actually an illustrator to illustrate some of the stories for visuals, since we weren't able to go around. Hiring a social media person. And then now we just got a round of funding from NC Humanities that's enabling us to engage groups of storytellers in other parts of the South to reinterpret the work of 3 other scholars who have been doing wonderful work on other parts of the South and their Latinx history. So that's the phase of the project that we're just beginning right now.
Thank you so much, Eric and Julie. My next question is about community partnership and collaboration. So each of your initiatives incorporate collaboration with community members and organizations into the core framework of the project. And I'm curious about how, as your project has grown, whether your working relationships and partnerships have changed alongside the growth of the project. What types of working relationships have led to the growth of the project? What types of partnerships or institutional structures have you outgrown as a result of the growth of this project, or perhaps had to put new structures in place in order to navigate? Lisa and Leslie, how about we start with you?
Well, I think you've asked a question that goes to two matters. And I think the first, I'd love to just pass over to Leslie so that she can explain the work that she does in connecting high schools, large high schools, part of big bureaucratic districts, to my course. I mean, and if you go, I will just say one more word. When I began to do this work, and I'd say, well, why can't we try to think about offering this in high schools? Or why can't we even offer it for professional development credit to teachers? And then maybe they would. I would be told, oh, every school district has its own regulations. They all have their own bureaucracy. We will never be able to navigate our way through that. That's not what we do. And I made a little bit of headway. Remember those 70 students I said I had, but it took a huge amount of time. Here's what Leslie, explain what you do. And I think that the navigation of systems and bureaucracies, I feel I'm being so boring, I'm a humanist, but has turned out to be so, such important work. Leslie, you're muted.
I think in any effort like this, relationships are key. It takes a village, it really takes a village. And I think when you have a powerful opportunity that you are offering, like we had with Poetry in America, that have presented with enthusiasm and presented simply, that the demand comes. And that's what happened with Lisa's course. And I think that too often when we, and I know I've learned this the hard way, that if we focus, I'm a big believer in substance and sizzle, and you need both to reach scale, and you need both to excite about partnerships, right? So you need the substance, number one. But if you don't think about the sizzle side as well, I think it's more challenging to build scale and to sustain it. And what I mean by sizzle is really simply the excitement of an opportunity, the ability to have impact. And I think that's one of the things that we did. And then of course, relationships. We also track the data very, very carefully to be able to flag how students are being impacted by this, and share that good news with our districts, which I think only strengthens those partnerships. So
Leslie, I think it would be so useful for people to hear how you work on the district, and you are an evangelist of the Sizzle, and that's much, but you have now built an organization where members of your team are constantly on the phone with school districts all over the country.
Yes,
Can you just say one more word about that?
Sure. So the way that what we learned is that every course like Lisa's requires someone that's tending to it at all levels. And so that means that you are responsive to the students, you are responsive to the classroom teacher, you are responsive to the teaching fellows that help grade and lead weekly discussions. We are responsive to school districts, and we are responsive to the universities. So all of those we sort of view in some ways as our clients. I mean, our mission is our students, but to serve our students, we have to be mindful of each of those stakeholders and each of those partners, and making them feel that they're valued, appreciated, and that they are benefiting from this in some way. And I think that's one of the sort of the secrets to successful partnerships. The benefits have to be to them as well. And I think you need to make an effort to make sure that they know that.
Yeah. Nice.
Thank you.
Yeah. Anybody else want to answer a question about community partnership? Yeah.
So when we, early on in this project, Julie and I were trying to develop how do we reach this population where we would say that we're Gen X and we're trying to reach a population that's Gen Z. And we knew going into this that the approach had to be that the population that we want to impact has to be part of the decision-making process. It wouldn't have worked if we were making decisions for them. What we knew is that we had something to offer, and we had something to be able to provide, and we had some guidance to give. But the decision-making process needed to come from the population. So the team that we were able to form around this with the team is a representation of those that we're trying to impact. The host, when you if you see us on video, we're mostly going to be represented by that population on social media as well. Those who are running our social media. And so it has become a sort of more diverse in terms of age, but in terms of the decision-making process, we look to them for the guidance to help us understand what we're doing right and in which directions we should be going to keep this project growing.
Yeah, and I'll just sort of add in terms of the scaling up piece that's been an evolution that I think has been both awesome and challenging. The awesome part is that people we started working with when they were college juniors and seniors are now out in the world. One is at Harvard Law School, someone who's from a farm worker family. One, fortunately, does a bunch of part-time jobs, and now Nuestro South is one of them, Axel. And so a cool thing that happened is that we were able to pay him to start being our grant writer, actually. So that's like professional growth for him, a year out of college, and also something we had money for, and then something Eric and I didn't have to do, so we could put our energy elsewhere. So that was like a cool part of the growth, was mentoring them truly into the leadership role and the people truly making the decisions and writing the grants. So that, with our guidance, and then he learns how to write grants. So that's been cool. I think what's been challenging is that all of us, we're still very much medium-sized. And so all of us have other jobs, right? Like Eric gets a stipend for his work on Nuestro South, but he has a full-time job at a nonprofit that is very full-time. And so fitting all of that into his schedule, even if we are able to compensate him for it, is challenging. You know, with some of our other sort of talent, like they also have other gigs and other things going on. This Nuestro South is not anybody's full-time job at this point. And probably won't be, right? When we think about the scale of the project, like I have hopes for its sustainability, and we're working on that now. And Eric will talk, I think, more about that later. Yeah, this probably isn't ever going to be anybody's full-time job. And so that is really, really challenging. Even if we have the money to pay people for their work, it's still challenging to like secure that space in their lives, because most of our jobs are not organized to necessarily create the space for this that's necessary.
If I just want to jump in for 1 second and say, this has become my full-time job. And I mean, that is, and there are costs to that and decisions. It wasn't what I had planned. And I now hire unemployed PhDs. I have a staff of 12 humanists I pay, and 3 of them are people who decided that the job market was not going to yield the careers they wanted, and now they work for Poetry in America. And just to follow up on what you said, Julie, the feeling that I feel so proud to be employing humanists and to sort of be opening up new directions for them. It's exciting.
Dave or Benjamin, any bits about collaboration?
Sure, I'll try to share a few, I guess.
Sure.
Well, so in a lot of ways, the initial, I want to say like the initial development and the continued development of the Emmett Till Memory Project app was, it started with collaboration. Having said that, this current iteration, along with the work at the Interpretive Center, is one wherein I think one of our, well, it's not, I think, I know like the most important partner that we have are members of the Till family. One of whom being the Reverend Willa Parker, and I'll also speak to the late Simeon Wright, for whom was also one of the earlier partners in the work of the commission and in us and in what we do when we share this narrative. Having said that, again, looking at how this app, or rather how by way of the app and what we do has expanded over the years, or is kind of refined over the years. When I speak with groups, or when I meet with folks that are interested in this narrative, a lot of the things that they ask, or a lot of the concerns that they share is, well, how do I find my place, right? Like what do I do next, or where do I go to learn more? Things of that nature. Very, very, very early on, the way I would answer that, or the way this organization answered that, was predicated on the resources available at the time. So there may have been 1 or 2 books around, or there may have been an internet clip or something to that effect. Over time, and again, in part due to the Memory Project app, we've been able to use that, like I shared earlier, as a resource, or as a means of expressing to people that, hey, there is more information out here, and this is one such tool that's readily available. But going back to the partnership, or rather the continued partnership of the Till family, this organization and community understands, to the degree that we can, that although we're connected and to this narrative, this is a tragedy that has impacted a family, right? And so very early on, when it comes to remembering and commemorating and remembering Emmett Till and Emmett Till Mobley and others, we knew that it was important to have buy-in and the green light, consistent buy-in and green light from members of the Till family. And so one of those persons being Reverend Willa Parker, he actually accompanied Emmett, or rather Emmett accompanied him to Mississippi during the summer of '55. And as you probably already know, he's one of the last remaining survivors, and is a survivor of his own right of everything that happened in '55. So to have his blessing and to have his input on what should and shouldn't be I wouldn't even say what should or shouldn't be shared, but on why certain things need to be shared and why certain things need to be remembered, and how we use storytelling and use these sites being that of the courthouse, but then also those other locations. Having his insight on that has kind of steered us in the way we share these stories, but also in the way that even the app has developed and evolved. At the core of what we do, we do our absolute best to ensure that we hold true to what Reverend Willa Parker and other members of the Till family have shared with us as it pertains to not just what this story is, but how and why it is what it is, and how we, even as an organization, have to be mindful of those things as we continue to kind of navigate through conversations and processes that we hope to give way to racial harmony in this area, as well as society at large. So I don't know how much time we got left, but Dave, you're welcome.
That was perfect. Thanks so much. So we're getting very close to our Q&A time, but I want to make sure that I can ask a question about how funding has impacted the growth of your projects. Maybe we can save like 4 minutes for this conversation. So how has funding been a factor in the growth of your projects? Can you speak a little bit to any insights or advice that you might have for folks who are looking to grow their projects through funding models?
I'll be quick here. So yeah, funding is always an issue. Like now, I'm currently fundraising and grant writing for the next version. That like fundraising and grant writing have been pretty much sort of a nonstop portion. But here's just one lesson I've learned doing this over the last, 8 years. Our major funder right now is the IMLS, the Institute for Museum and Library Services. It took a long time to get that grant. And one of the things that changes, we had the exact same grant. When I mean the exact same, I mean, we copied and pasted narratives from grant application to grant application to grant application, right? Because we tinkered a little bit, but more or less we had our narrative, we had our idea, and we were just looking for funders. Grant number 1, turned down. Grant number 2, turned down. Grant number 3, it finally takes. And so we're thinking, okay, what changed with grant number 3? Here's one thing that changed. On grants number 1 and 2, we took the exact same narrative and we ran it through the grant development office at the University of Kansas, where I work, right? And there's a lot of advantages to that, right? Like they have an office that takes care of lots of stuff. Grant number 3, we ran it through the nonprofit that Benjamin works for in the Delta. And the exact same narrative that was once rejected was now funded. And so one of the lessons I've learned, and that we've just sort of made that our standard practice, that when we have grant opportunities, we want to run as much of them through the nonprofit as possible. That's partially, well, there's lots of reasons for it. I think there's probably some red flags that go up when a reviewer sees a Kansas project for a Mississippi story, right? But also there's overhead involved. I'd rather have that overhead go to the nonprofit than the university. So there's a variety of reasons. In addition to the practical, it worked better for us. So that's one lesson I've learned from funding, but I'm all ears for other lessons because, we need them.
Yeah, cut the cord. I think thinking that your interests and the university's interests are absolutely aligned is incorrect. They're often not aligned, and those bureaucracies that in some ways help you, in other ways hold you back, including that many funding organizations don't want to pay all that overhead to the university and would rather see it directly benefit your project or those it serves. I would just add here that grants, the bigger they are, the more prestigious they are, the more time consuming they are. It's really better sometimes to tell a compelling story to an alum of your institution, or to find out that community that really cares about what you do. The labor that I expend on my most prestigious grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities, from the Sloan Foundation, is many times the labor that goes into often getting much larger grants by being aware of who in the community really does care about this. And so really experimenting with getting outside the university and its processes, I think can really be helpful.
Thank you so much. Julia, do you have like a
Yeah,
quick?
just so we're ready to get out from under it all together and trying to do more crowdsourcing from our audience, selling merch, Patreon, sponsorships from businesses that are on brand. We think, we know our content's being consumed, and I think there's now a culture that folks will sometimes chip in a little bit. So that's where we're headed.
Yeah, that also really makes sense for your audience, right? Merch for a Gen Z audience makes total sense.
But I think in terms of lessons that we've learned is that early on, the trouble that we had getting funding was that we were untested. Nobody had ever done anything like this before. And so there wasn't a model that we were following. We were developing a prototype. And so now that we have a prototype, we knew that where we needed to invest was in engagement. And so that's our investment in our social media manager, and investing in that engagement piece outside of the content piece, I think really kind of changed the game for us as well. So now we're at a point where we're getting more support, we're getting a little bit more investment, and what we're looking to do is invest in more scholars, particularly Latino scholars that are from the area, and many of whom Julie has mentored, to bring up to this level. And so now that we have a prototype, we have something that we can a proof of concept that we can go and we can say now we're ready to scale.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Proof of concept being sort of at the core of scaling up the funding front. So we have two really great questions in the chat that I want to make sure we have time for before we wrap up at 2. One question is from Aaron Benet at Case Western Reserve, who has started a new public humanities certificate program and is thinking about growing one of the projects beyond the university classroom. And she's asking how you all identified the next stages of your projects that would enable it to grow or scale up. So in other words, what kinds of questions or processes helped you decide what modality would work best for your next phase? What bits and pieces of the project did you decide were worthy of scaling?
So for us, we brought the team together that we had to help us guide what those next steps would be. A lot of this was based on how this project is impacting us personally and the people around us, and it helped us understand where do we want to grow in this direction, because we could have gone in many different directions at that point, but it was the team that we have built that is a reflection of the community that helped us say, hey, that's I mean, there are North Star, right? So we follow that.
I had no brilliant ideas. We just brought the team together and said, you're the audience, you're the talent, what do you want to do? It's never.
I think I sometimes discover the next step when I realize I've missed something. Like I had a very cherished founding partner who was an undergraduate I worked with, and I didn't think she'd stay. She stayed with me for 7 years, and I thought maybe we'd be there together forever. And she left, which was okay. She left having learned to produce television with me in order to become a podcast executive. And she said to me, she said, Lisa, TV is, I love you, but TV is kind of over, and in some ways, and I need to be in the next industry. And I realized that audio was going to be important. I wasn't quite sure, how or when to get into it, but But that's become clear to me, and that's something we are working on now. How do we create something unique for audio where there's and I, like you all, completely have to rely on others because I'm too old. I'm a latecomer to podcasts. I'm a latecomer to that. And I think understanding as the founder, all that the organization is going to grow beyond you, that you are actually not going to be able to be, the puppeteer of every single little part of it. And if it's going to grow, you're going to need people with expertise and foresight who see beyond corners that you don't.
And I want to transition us to our last question. And I wish I could spend a whole webinar event talking about this one question. I'm going to read it word for word because I think it's really important. And maybe Dave and Benjamin, we can start with you because I think it's most applicable. So far, these projects seem to be born out of a personal commitment and passion. Could you reflect on what that means for public humanities? If we want to scale up public humanities on a grand scale, should we find ways that public humanities are not only rooted in personal commitment, or should we think about this the other way around, creating more pathways for those who have passionate concerns, right? So is public humanities born out of passion, commitment?
Yeah, that's a good question. I wish I could just say I don't know, but I'll keep talking anyways. One of the things I reflect on as I reflect on my own journey is, yes, the Emmett Till Memory Project has become a passion project, but it didn't start that way. And if we can keep this between us, as all 70 of us, just between us, I didn't pour myself into the Emmett Till Memory Project because I was passionate for racial justice. It almost worked the other way around, right? That I had this opportunity to work with some friends to do this project, and the more I poured myself into the memory project, the more I became passionate about racial justice and movements writ large. And so there is, I think, what I want to say is I think both things are true, right? I think both things are true in my own experience, and I think both things are true writ large, that these projects are, like any project, they probably depend on some level of personal engagement. But then that engagement is not like the end point of personal attachment, but rather like the beginning point, that the more you're in, the more it grows. And I'm not sure, and I hesitate to say this with such a public, but I think you're right. I just think we need both, I guess. I think we need pathways for a broad range of people to be involved, no matter their particular levels of passion, right? And I think that kind of goes back to one of the founding questions that Michelle set us up with today, that these projects are fundamentally collaborative projects, right? And that there has never been a moment in any of these projects where they were like Julie's good idea or Dave's good idea or something, right? It was always like from the beginning, they were groups of people coming together. And when that has happened, at least in the context of the Emmett Till Memory Project, there have always been enough people around that have provided enough avenues of entrance for people from widely differing points on the political spectrum to be involved. And that has been really important. I mean, that's the story, honestly, of the Emmett Till Memorial Commission, right? Of sort of people in Tallahatchie County coming together, really sort of despite their uncommon motivations, right? And getting stuff done, right? And so if we can create pathways for people who are passionate and create pathways for people who are not, I think that's one of the great benefits of collaboration.
I really value that answer and that honesty. Dave, thank you so much. Any final thoughts before we?
So I just wanted to add to that. I'm not a humanities scholar. Obviously, I'm representing this on the community side, and that's to say that these projects initiate in academia, but the question is, who do they belong to and who are they for, right? And that in the beneficiaries of this work should really be the ones that it's developed for, and make it accessible to the beneficiaries, and not just keep it, in books that will only that that stay within an echo chamber of other scholars.
And I'll just add, for me, I think just talking about this affective piece and passion, I think for me, the missing piece, Dave talks about his sort of emotional journey. My missing piece was confidence that anybody cared. Even like, you just fantasize that they care, you want them to care, you're not just writing for your colleagues. But even if I had been smart enough to come up with this podcast idea, I don't think I ever would have had the confidence that like anyone's going to listen to it. It just almost seems too good to be true. And I think what we hear from all of this, and what Eric is just constantly bringing to the table along with the rest of our team, is like, Julie, we care a lot. Your research matters to me a lot. And it feels too good to be true. It feels like a fantasy. But then you see what's happening in the public sphere, elections being won and lost over the way that history is told. And this matters a lot.
I think this really is the essential point, that there is, what we're hearing here is a reorientation in our projects away from the scholarly audiences, the committees, the tenure processes that actually, as academics, consume most of our time, and toward the audiences, we all believe humanities for all. And I think our passion has only grown as we've realized that that people do love the humanities, learn from it, value it, need it. And, the world doesn't need another white paper. It needs a reorientation to those audiences.
I love this. I feel like we could keep going on this front for many, many more hours. And thank you all for that really fruitful reorientation at the end. But we've reached the end of our hour together. And I just wanted to thank our panelists across the board for their generosity and for donating their time and expertise today. Our final webinar in our Public Humanities webinar series will be on measuring impact and the role of assessment in publicly engaged humanities projects, which will be happening on February 16th from 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern time. If you have any additional questions for our panelists, I'm sure that they would love to hear from you. But in the meantime, I hope you all enjoyed this conversation, and we hope to see you soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you all.